Hello and thank you for joining me. The title of this lesson is The Strength of Weakness, and the title comes from some words we're going to read in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10. While you're getting turned there in your Bible, let me say that obviously you've noticed the background looks different, what's behind me. It is. I'm in a different office, in a different house, in a different city, and I'm beginning what I hope to be is a fresh new ministry. So I'm kind of excited about this, and I appreciate your prayers for my wife and I as we go forward. 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul wrote to the members of the church at Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 10. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, weaknesses, in reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Now, we read words like this in the Bible and we wonder, well, what planet was the Apostle Paul living on? Because obviously his words reflected a natural thinking, and someone will say, well, the world doesn't work that way, bro, and that's exactly right. And we're reminded at the beginning that God's ways, his thoughts, his methods, his choices, his standards are different than ours, different than those of the world. And he talked about this, for example, in Isaiah chapter 55. He said, my ways are not your ways, and my thoughts are not your thoughts. As the heaven is higher than the earth, so are my ways and my thoughts higher than yours. Now, to understand the meaning of the words we read in our text, we have to view them in the light of the context in which Paul wrote them. So we're going to back up here a little bit in 2 Corinthians, and we'll back up and I'll bring you up to ultimately what we're going to look at today in chapter 12 and verse 10. So beginning at chapter 10 and verse 1 and running all the way through chapter 12 and verse 13, you have the Apostle Paul defending his apostleship and his ministry. Now, you ask, well, why would he have to do that with the Corinthian church members? They knew him. He had been with them. He had taught them. Well, in Paul's absence, after he had moved on to some other ministry, Jewish legalistic teachers came in, and they began to teach God's people, teach the members of the church. Now, these guys were flashy. They were boastful. They were deceptive. In fact, Paul described them in chapter 11 and verse 13. He described them as false apostles who were able to transform themselves or make themselves appear to be legitimate apostles of Christ. But it was a facade, but they were very skilled at deception. Now, they blew their own horns, and what they did is they appealed to the Corinthians' sense of fleshly pride. Their goal was to bring the Lord's people into spiritual bondage, to rob their joy, cancel their Christian joy, and ultimately to make trophies out of them. To get traction, they had to negate Paul's teaching, negate his message of truth, which required that they discredit Paul himself. And so they said mean things about him. They said, for example, he's a really tough guy when he's not here and he writes to you, but when he's here in bodily presence, well, he's just kind of a timid guy. He's sickly. They called attention to the fact that Paul had some physical problems. He must have been a rather sickly type of guy, or at least he had episodes of illness. And so they said, well, he's not a good speaker. He's not a flashy preacher like we are. So their argument was, surely this guy, Paul, can't be a legitimate apostle of Christ. Okay, and so the problem was they were telling lies about Paul, twisting things, and the problem was the Corinthians were buying into this trash. Chapter 11, verse 22, Paul begins what is known theologically as the Fool's Song. And it's like this. He says, okay, if these guys are going to brag about themselves, which they obviously did, if they're going to brag, if they're going to boast, I guess I'll do a little bragging too. And so his boasting, quote unquote, is as he went on, you go on and read, his boasting was not what one would expect, because he gave a resume of his sufferings and his hardships that he experienced in the gospel ministry and the cause of Christ. You can read about these things in verses 24 through 29 of chapter 11. And there's a subtlety here. Now, what he did is he used supreme irony to cause the braggarts, the false teachers, who bragged on themselves. Paul used supreme irony to cause the braggarts really to hang themselves. He says, okay, well, here are my credentials as an apostle and what it's cost me. Now, guys, what can you bring to the table, okay? Now, chapter 12, so we're getting closer to our text. Chapter 12, the first 6 verses, Paul wrote of a man who had an out-of-this-world experience. So in chapter 12 and verse 1, he said, "It is doubtless not profitable for me to boast. I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord." So in other words, he understood, no one's really interested in these things that I've talked about, the hardships and the sufferings that I've experienced in the work of the ministry. So he said, well, okay, I'll step this up and we'll talk about visions and revelations of the Lord. Of course, you can hear somebody saying, all right, now here we go. People are ever interested in the spectacular. And so, Paul's got people suddenly, I'm sure they're on the edge of their seats. Now, he tells of a man that he knew, this is the way he puts it, a man he knew who 14 years earlier, to the time he wrote, had an out-of-this-world experience. This man was caught up, he literally was raptured to the third heaven, which Paul also called paradise. So these were Jewish expressions for what we would call the heaven of heavens. Now, whether this experience was in the body or out of the body, the man, well, he just didn't know. What did he see? See, that's, people want to know, well, what did he see? He didn't say. Okay, well, if he did say what he saw, then what did he hear? Well, he couldn't say. In fact, Paul says, this is verse 4 of chapter 12, the man heard inexpressible words, which it is not lawful for a mortal man to utter. Inexpressible words. Now, I remember some years ago hearing a radio preacher. He was trying to sell a book. And he said the selling point was he knew what those inexpressible words Paul heard were. And I gave it away. The man, obviously, as we're going to see, who was caught up to the third heaven was the Apostle Paul himself. But the man, he knew what those inexpressible words were, and he put them in a book. And so for $19.95 plus shipping and handling, you could get his book and know what these inexpressible words were. I've often wondered, well, how many people did he dupe into wasting their money in buying his book? So who was the man? Well, the man who had the out-of-the-world experience, as I noted already, was the Apostle Paul himself. So you say, well, why didn't he just come out and say this at the beginning? Well, the information was personal. Paul wrote about this reluctantly. He was uncomfortable, but the situation required that he give some information. Now, in verses 5 and 6 of chapter 12, Paul goes on to say, of such a one I will boast, yet of myself I will not boast. See, he still has the false teachers, the braggarts in mind. Of myself I will not boast, yet in my infirmities, in my strengthlessnesses. For though I might desire to boast, I will not be a fool, for I will speak the truth. So, what's he saying? There are some things I could tell you, and it wouldn't be boasting. They're true. So I think my dad has an expression, it's not bragging if it's true, right? But Paul says, but I refrain, some things I'm not going to share with you, lest anyone should think of me above what he sees me or hears me to be. So this gives us some insight on why he was reluctant to give very much information. So this brings us to the subject of Paul's thorn in the flesh. And we read of this in chapter 12, 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and let's pick up in verse 7. So Paul says, now he's explaining something. And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given me. Now, if you write in your Bible, you need to underline those words, was given me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, to strike me, lest, or in order that I not be exalted above measure. So verse 7 is explanatory. Paul had a physical problem. Now, we're never told what it was. Some people think it was a problem with his eyesight. We don't know. Others have thought that he had MS, multiple sclerosis. Maybe so. We're not told. But see, the false apostles, they pointed to this problem, whatever it was, and they pointed and said, well, this is an indicator that Paul is not a legitimate servant or representative of Jesus Messiah. So they would say the case they made, the fact that he had this problem showed that he did not have God's approval and blessings. So if Paul was in God's favor, if he had the Lord's approval, if he were legitimate, they argued that he would not have this problem. See, so that was a powerful argument they made. It kind of makes me think of a related story in John chapter 9. In Jerusalem, the Lord's apostles, they came across a man who was born blind. And so obviously he had a problem, and the disciples, the Lord's disciples asked him, Lord, who sinned? Who's at fault? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Well, that's kind of stupid, particularly what did this guy do before he was born that caused him to be born blind? That's kind of stupid, but you have to understand in their way of thinking, illness, problems were indicators of God's disapproval and his withholding of blessings. And so the false teachers were using this against Paul. So he had a thorn in the flesh. Now, thorn is some physical problem, but thorn is misleading. The Greek word actually is skolpos, which was a sharp stake. So what we understand from this is that whatever Paul's problem was, it was not minor irritation. Now, this was given him. I called your attention to that when we read this thorn in the flesh, this skolops was given him. You say, well, by whom? The Lord gave it to him. We could say the Lord allowed it as a gift. We'll see this as a gift. You say, well, that's not a very good gift. Well, as it turned out for Paul, it was something that he needed. Now, Paul also called this a messenger of Satan to buffet or to strike me. So there was a purpose in the Lord giving or allowing Paul to have this problem. And he said, lest I be exalted above measure because of the abundance of the revelations. So the problem was given to him as a check on pride and ego. You say, well, did Paul have problems with this? Was he a man? Was he human? Yes, he was. So obviously these were problems for him, just like they are for us. So the gift was meant to check his pride and his ego, to keep others from thinking that he was something that he wasn't, and then to help him understand his constant need for the Lord's grace and for his help. Now, let me check my time here. There's a story I just wanted to put in here of an Old Testament story of a king Uzziah, king of Judah. Now, he started out as a good king. He followed the Lord, And the Bible tells us that he was helped marvelously. I mean, he prospered, he was victorious in battle. And so he did marvelously until he was strong. And the Bible makes this statement that when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. So we would say it this way, when he became established and strong, he got too big for his britches. And you read his story, he crossed a line. And God struck him with leprosy. And so that cost him dearly. All right. So verse 8 then, continuing on. So Paul talked about his thorn in the flesh, his skolops, the sharp stake in the flesh. Verse 8, he goes on and he says, well, let's read this. He pleaded with the Lord 3 times about this. He said, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. Lord, I beg you, please take this away from me. It's painful. It's embarrassing. At times it is debilitating. And so obviously Paul prayed seriously. Pleaded is a strong word. And it's really interesting just to ponder this. He had the gift of healing, but clearly he could not heal himself. Healing was never done indiscriminately. So verse 9, the Lord answered his prayer. And he, Jesus, said to me, literally the verb tense there is perfect. He has said to me, this his final word, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, this is Paul, most gladly will I rather boast in my infirmities. I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So what do we take from this? Well, Paul pleaded with the Lord 3 times, take it away, and the Lord's answer was no. So it's like, Paul, my dear child, I know you don't like this, but you need this problem. So the Lord allows his children to have problems. Some we create ourselves, but he uses our problems to teach us, to train us, and in some cases, and I think this was true with the Apostle Paul, to restrain us. Paul was a man who had a wonderful intellect. He was a go-getter, and he naturally would have a tendency to get out ahead of the Lord. And so, if you want to call it this way, his thorn in the flesh was kind of like a chain on him that the Lord used to pull him back. Okay, well, I think that would be accurate. But the Lord's intention with problems that he gives us or allows us to have are never to make us bitter, but always to make us better. Now, I want to add to this, and I think this is very important. Where a physical problem is concerned, my goodness, seek treatment. We're not told. Paul, he probably sought some medical treatment for whatever his problem was. Where a physical problem, is concerned, man, seek treatment. That's a common sense thing. Take medicine. But all the while understanding that if healing occurs, it is God who gives the healing. So, my grace is sufficient for you. With the grace, my grace, with the problem comes grace to handle it. My grace is sufficient for you. The Lord will supply the grace to handle and profit from the problem. So we have these words, my strength is made perfect in weakness, or in strengthlessness, literally. Now, what does this mean? Maybe I can illustrate with a story from the Old Testament. The judge Gideon, the Midianites, the enemies of God's people, had invaded their land. And I mean, they were like grasshoppers. There were so many you couldn't count them. And so God chose Gideon to be a military leader of his people. So Gideon, he gathered an army of Israelites, and the army numbered 32,000 men. Well, in comparison with the Midianites, that was just, that was nothing. They were far superior numerically and in equipment as well. But God said to Gideon, I think you read this back in Judges chapter 5, chapter 6. God said, Gideon, the people with you, there are too many of them. I can't give you victory because there are too many. Because you'll go out and if you win the battle with Midianites, Israel's going to say, well, you know, our strength, we're good fighters. We won because we're good fighters. So God said, you have too many. We have to cut the number down. And so he did. The first cut, I think it was 22,000 men left. And the second cut, another, another great group left. What that would leave, I'm not even going to try to figure it right now. But the bottom line, when all was said and done, there were only 300 fighters left. And God said, in essence, okay, I can work with this now, because humanly speaking, the odds are impossible. And God says, I have room to operate now. And so that when the victory comes, there's not going to be any doubt whose power was involved in this. Okay, so I hope that helps you understand how God's strength is made perfect in weakness, comes full circle, or the Lord is able to work in circumstances that seem like, man, this can't work. Now, so often, God can't do what He wants to do because we are in His way. How about that? And I think sometimes we can even try to help God out. And you wonder sometimes, well, poor God, what would He do without the help of His people? Well, He might do a lot better. I don't know. So we would think that Paul could have done so much more for the Lord if he didn't have this problem. But the Lord thought otherwise. So the problem tempered him and made him useful. So we understand that it is through imperfect, weak, and limited people who will trust the Lord to do great things for them that He can most fully demonstrate His power. So this brings us to where we started, verse 10 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So Paul had come to understand the reason for his problem. He knew the Lord could take it away, yet he understood he needed his problem, and he came to accept it as best for him when the Lord gave him the final word. Now this doesn't mean that he said whoopee and well, you know, Lord, you give me another illness. No, it hurt. It just simply means in his mind he determined, okay, this is best for me. So when I am weak, then I am strong. How do we define this? When I'm broken of self-reliance and self-sufficiency, when I'm broken of me, when I realize that without the Lord I can do nothing, and I become fully reliant on Him, when I say to Him, Lord, I don't know what you can do with me, but here I am. Use me however you see fit. Here's the place that He wants me to be, and He can use me, and the strength that I have is not mine, but it is His. And so God, as He's able to work in and through me, my life, your life, others get to see what God does. Not about us, not what we can crow about, but others see what God can do. And He gets the credit. And people are drawn to Him, unsaved people, and saved people are drawn to Him. So the way God works. Now some things to take away. Whatever brings us to our knees in prayer is a good thing. He sometimes says no to our requests. He does not always take away our problems, though He can. The things that we might think disqualify us from useful service are the very things that God uses to qualify us to be used by Him. We might not always understand the reason for whatever problem we have or whatever limitation He allows us to have, but we must understand that a child of God cannot have a problem unless He allows it. And if He allows it, we need it. It is ultimately for our good and for His glory. And in allowing us to have a problem, maybe it's temporary and He's simply preparing us for a greater usefulness and a higher level of service. But we can learn to rest in His care and in His wisdom in dealing with us. So that's the lesson I have for you. I think it's a good lesson for us all. Very helpful. And I hope that you find the lesson helpful. Now, as always, thank you for joining me in these videos. If you like the content, please hit the like button. Feel free to share this with others. And if you're not subscribed to the channel, I ask that you would do that. That would be a great help to me. I would appreciate it. So again, thank you. The Lord bless you, and I hope you can join me in subsequent videos. God bless.